Well, good afternoon. My name is Brian Krusniak, and I'm going to talk a little bit about an update on the Google Fiber project, but more generally talk about internet and broadband connectivity in Northeast Missouri, because it's kind of all related, Google Fiber and the rest of the broadband initiatives that are going on throughout the country. My day job is Assistant Vice President for ITS over at A.T. Still University. There I'm responsible for all of the information technology and services at both our Arizona campus and our campus here in Missouri. So you can see my interest in technology really extends beyond this project, and I have a belief that infrastructure is really what enables the technology. So I'm a big infrastructure guy in terms of getting technology right and making it useful. There are a couple of other things that I think are interesting in terms of timing with what's going on in terms of infrastructure and our community in the Kirksville area. One is I see a development of kind of a virtual layer of services and entities getting built over a community. It used to be that communities were kind of judged on how many parks you had, what your signage looked like, your zoning laws, all of those kinds of things. What's happening now is so much of the world is data moving back and forth. There's a virtual layer that's going on top of all of that, and especially for us as a community built on higher education and in some ways healthcare, I see this as being an area that we need to focus on a little bit more to get students to come here and for us to really drive some of the economic development in the community. And that's the next thing is economic development. Certainly 2 years ago, even a year ago, you could argue that having supreme infrastructure would make you more competitive in terms of economic development. I'm not sure that that's still true. I think now you have to have a good infrastructure in your community just to be considered. So it doesn't have that same cachet that it once did. It's just something like having parks, water systems, sewer systems, and other services. So with that in mind, let's get into it a little bit. What I want to go through today is, since this group is business, I want people to understand just what the fiber broadband connectivity infrastructure is all about and why it's important. Don't let me get caught up in technical details of how much bandwidth and whatnot. I'm going to try and oversimplify in a lot of cases so that we can get a better understanding of just what's going on and how it might impact your business. So let's think about metaphors. So the metaphor that's commonly used for the internet is a plumbing metaphor, where it's the size of the pipes that matter. There's some truth in that. There's another metaphor that's out there that the internet is kind of like electricity was 150 or whatever years ago. And you needed to be on the grid in order to build a thriving community, and there's some truth in that. But I think the best metaphor is the interstate highway system. And that's another common metaphor that we use. But if you think about the road system as it developed throughout the 1920s and 30s, really up until about 1955, that's when the core of the road system developed. What was in place there, you can see from this map, 1955, that really there were pretty much roads you could get anywhere that you needed to go. The problem was that in 1955, most of those roads had been built based on 1930s standards. So they didn't take into account the faster cars for the 1950s or the truck transportation needs, those kinds of things. I think that's kind of where we're at in terms of the internet today. It's a relatively young industry. And there's a lot of hype associated with it, but we don't really understand just what's going to happen over the next 50 years. And that's a caution. So when we try to understand what's going on with broadband or internet infrastructure, there are really three kind of areas to consider, and you'll hear these terms frequently, so I think they're important from a business standpoint. The way that the information travels on the internet is it starts out from your computer and it goes to someone else's computer. The path that it takes typically has three components. So it goes from your computer to a central office in your local town. Okay, that's that last mile. That's the piece that gets you from your home or business to the central office. Then that central office goes to other offices, and it may go through 3 or 4 different cities before it gets to the computer on the other end. And then on the other end, it'll go back that same way. So the long haul circuits are these big pipes, if you will, in the middle. The U.S. is in pretty decent shape in terms of long haul circuits. These are almost all fiber connections, and we have a fair number of them. So from that standpoint, I think we're in decent shape. The areas that I think we're more concerned about, we need to be more concerned about, are the middle mile and the last mile. And the middle mile is an area that's the connections between the cities. It's probably not all fiber today. A lot of our infrastructure is still built on telephony infrastructure. And so the connections between cities may simply be copper connections between the two cities. And then we talk about that last mile, and it's definitely not an area that we're focused on there, where we've got good connectivity, good infrastructure. And the cost structure of putting in these improved infrastructure is really a little bit different, because most of the cost is in the labor of laying the cables. So once those cables are laid, then it gets a little bit easier to just pick up and move the endpoints and improve the endpoints so that you can get more data over that pipe. It's not like water where you can only push so much through. You can do it a little bit with pressure, but not so much. So that's where we're at with the infrastructure. If then we start thinking about just what is broadband. Okay, so broadband is the term that we hear. There's a national broadband plan. There's Missouri Broadband now. It's all about broadband. Well, what is broadband? Broadband connectivity today for the U.S. plan is defined at 4 meg. Okay, so somewhere in this area is what we're considering broadband. In a lot of cases, this is a minimum threshold. So this is the minimum threshold that is required to do different kinds of things. So if we look at anything less than that would be considered dial-up. Anything more than that would be considered fiber. Things in the middle are that common DSL cable connectivity. If we look at this chart, it shows kind of the types of users and why we need to have more bandwidth. It depends on the types of things that you're doing. So if all we're doing are browsing the internet and using email, we could all survive on these relatively low connections. If we start wanting to be able to do things like YouTube videos, we need a little bit more. If we want to start streaming, if we want to start watching classrooms, class activities on the internet, we need a little bit more bandwidth. And if we want to start doing some really interactive things where you've got two-way connectivities going back and forth, or multiple people collaborating with things, then you need even more. But you can see here, even in this today's world, the maximum bandwidth that is projecting that we need is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 meg. So this somewhere between here and here is reasonable speed for end customer at home with maybe one computer. Now if we start adding up kids, so my kids are watching something and I'm doing something else, they're watching something on TV and I'm trying to have a business call, now I need a little bit more as I start adding that together. How does the U.S. compare around the world? One of the popular misconceptions or conceptions of the United States is that we're at the leading edge of technology around the world, and in some ways that's true. but it certainly isn't there in terms of our infrastructure. When you look at the U.S. infrastructure, the U.S. is kind of in the middle teens in terms of speed and also in terms of coverage, which we'll see in a little bit. So in terms of speed, we're at about 4.6 meg is the average speed for the U.S. So again, that's at about that broadband connectivity. But only 30% of our country is above that 5 meg. So the issue is really one of the future. We're okay for right now, but it's really about trying to build for the future and what we're going to need there. So in early 2009, the federal government, Congress, told the FCC to put together a plan on this. Okay, so that was launched in April of 2009. Shortly after that initiative was launched, Missouri got on board and kicked off the Missouri Broadband Now project, which kind of tied a couple of these things together. This plan was delivered in March of 2010, and about that exact same time, the Google Fiber for Communities project was initiated. And the goal of that project was to build a fiber network to the home. And so you can see this project was a little bit different than the goals of these projects. These projects are trying to get 4 meg. This project is giving 1,000 meg. And that's why it was such an exciting project for much of the country, and there was so much competition to get involved in it. So from the U.S. standpoint, the plan has 6 goals. The first goal is to have 33% of the population having high-speed connections. So it's really that forward thinking, trying to get by 2020 a third of the population to have these connections where we can do more than what we can do today. One area that we haven't talked a lot about is mobile and the ability to use mobile technologies to do some of these things. And in some ways, you hear it's all going to be wireless anyway. Well, that's not really true. Most of these mobile technologies are going to put us in that 4 to 8 meg bandwidth areas. Again, it's not something that's going to lead us at this stage until we see more breakthroughs into solving the problems for the long term. Universal access was the third goal. We're familiar with that in a variety of contexts. Fourth goal, high speed to community anchor institutions. So that's where you see libraries, hospitals, schools all connected on bigger connections. And then the last two are a little bit more specialized. The first one is in first responders, so having pushing that money out through the public safety network and having first responders have access to that. And there's a lot of money that can be saved by getting all of those first responders on that same network. And then in terms of energy consumption, again, a ton of opportunities if we can start tracking our energy consumption via broadband.